St. Mark's, may the peace of Christ be with you all. Earlier in the worship service, we took a few moments to honor all the dads in our congregation, those who helped bring us into the world and those who helped guide our spiritual steps. And later on today, I'm sure, whether it's brunch, lunch, or dinner, many families will be taking their dads out to lunch. So for all the dads who are with us this morning and all the dads who are joining us online, I thought I'd share some dad jokes so you can share them later on with the rest of your family members. Just to start us off, here's a picture that's kind of associated with dad jokes. If you do a Google search dad jokes online, this picture often pops up. And if you can see in the picture, they're at a restaurant and dad seems to have cracked a joke, and in the classic sense of a dad joke, it wasn't that great, and so all the family members are kind of hiding their faces in shame. That's kind of typical of the dad jokes, just to lower the bar here at this moment. You could keep this picture up, David, just for a few moments. So here's a few dad jokes to start us off with. Do you know how Moses starts his day? He brews a pot of coffee. What do nice pirate kids do on Father's Day? They take out the garbage without being asked. See, these are typical dad jokes. They're terrible. Did you hear about the red and blue ship that collided? All the sailors were marooned. What do you call a wizard who's good with ceramics? Harry Pottery. Do you know the favorite hymn of every dentist? Crown him with many crowns. A Christian congregation today. Which prophet broke the most commandments? Moses. He broke all 10 at once. I walked into the kitchen yesterday and said to my dad, "Hey, I'm hungry." And my dad said, "Hi, hungry. I'm Dad." Why did God create man before woman? Because God didn't want any advice on how to do it. Last one, I promise you. What do you call a person who is not a dad but tells dad jokes? A faux pas. Note to self, don't quit your day job. Thanks for the picture, David. If you're joining us for the first time this morning, we're just a few weeks into a brand new sermon series. And because we are in a time in the church calendar that's often called Ordinary Time, the title of our sermon series is called 12 Ordinary Men. That's based on the 12 disciples. So far in this sermon series, we've already looked at the first two disciples. We started with Peter and his brother Andrew. And this morning, the disciple we're looking at is the first of another set of brothers, and his name is James. Would you all say his name with me? James. Let me share a little bit about James before we get into the passages. James, along with his brother John, were both fishermen, much like Peter and Andrew, and according to the Gospel of Matthew, they all became disciples around the same time. Matthew wrote that after calling Peter and Andrew, Jesus went a little farther and then called James and John. Most likely, these two sets of brothers might have known each other. They might have been childhood friends. Their parents surely must have known each other. But the Bible tells us a little bit more about James and John's background than it does for Peter and Andrew. For example, we are told that James and John together were called the sons of Zebedee. That was the name of their father. We also find out the name of their mother later on in the scriptures. Her name was Salome. We also find out that this particular family was rather successful with their fishing business because in another Bible passage we're told that they had hired hands. Most fishing families did all their work themselves, both husband and wife, and any children they had, they all were part of the family business, but only the successful ones were able to bring on hired hands and actually take on employees, and apparently this family was one of them. Then we are told that this family was well connected. Later on in John's gospel, this was already after Jesus was arrested and being taken to the high priest. Peter was allowed to follow him and enter into the inner courtyard of the high priest, and that was only because of John, who was known to the high priest, who used his family connections to get Peter inside. So James and John's family were connected to the higher-ups, so to speak. They knew people who knew people. Their family name carried weight. Lastly, it's often thought that James was the number 2 disciple, not chronologically, but in terms of stature, rank, and position. For example, in Mark's gospel, where he lists the 12 disciples, James is listed second only after Peter. Also then in the book of Acts, which again lists the 12 disciples, James is mentioned before Andrew, even though Andrew was the brother of Peter, disciple number 1. Then in the stories where Jesus brought the inner 3 disciples, the inner circle, Peter, James, and John, again, James is always listed second. That goes to show his prominence and his station or his rank that James had among the 12 disciples. Just a little bit of background information on James. We'll find out more as we go into the passages. The first passage I'd like to read this morning tells us a little bit about his personality or his temperament, so to speak, where there was almost an incident that took place while Jesus and the disciples were on the road. The story is told in Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 56, as the group was making their way towards Jerusalem. I'm reading from the NIV translation this morning. So if you'd like to follow along in the Pew Bibles, that begins on page 1113. Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 56. Let us prepare our hearts and minds for the reading of God's word. Samaritan opposition. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him, but the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them, even as Elijah did?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and he said, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went to another village. Our second passage comes from Acts chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. And it is believed that this story took place approximately 14 years after the resurrection. What is unique about this passage is that it records the death of James, who, outside of Judas, who took his own life, was the only disciple whose death is described in the Bible. Give me a moment. Acts chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death by the sword. When he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. These are the words of the Lord. whenever the Bible talks about James, he is seldom mentioned by himself. Except for the passage in Acts which recorded his death, James is almost always mentioned in the company of others. When he was called together with his brother. When he saw the transfiguration of Jesus Christ, it was with Peter and John. When he saw Jairus' daughter being brought back to life, again, it was in the company of Jesus and the inner circle. James is almost always mentioned in the company of others, meaning there isn't really a story about just James himself, except in the story of Acts where he was killed by Herod. Also, there are several James in the New Testament, which often gets confusing. There's James, our disciple for this morning, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee. But there was also another disciple named James. He was the son of Alphaeus, also known as James the Lesser. Then there was another James, the author of the book of James, later on in the New Testament. This is a completely different James. He was actually the half-brother of Jesus Christ, and now was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So who was James? What was he like? Our first passage, the one from the Gospel of Luke, which describes the Samaritan opposition, gives us a glimpse of what kind of person he was like. And to understand this passage, a little context helps. In Luke chapter 9, verse 51, we were told that as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out to Jerusalem. In other words, the 3-year earthly ministry was coming to an end, and now Jesus was on a one-way flight to Jerusalem with no return ticket. This meant that this would be his final journey to Jerusalem, where the events of that last Holy Week would unfold. Verse 51 said, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. It's the NIV translation. Other translations say it this way: he set his face to go to Jerusalem. The Message version says it this way: he gathered up his courage and steeled himself for the journey to Jerusalem. In other words, this wasn't going to be a sightseeing trip or a weekend getaway. Jesus was on a one-way mission which would end on a cross. Verse 52-53 reads, Jesus sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready there for him, but the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. Apparently, the layover in Samaria was supposed to be just a quick pit stop, a time to grab a quick bite to eat, use the restroom, fill up the gas tank, and get back on the road. The Samaritans had hoped that Jesus would have stayed a few days, not just a few hours, and when they found out that Samaria was just a quick layover, that's what got them upset. My family goes to Mammoth Lakes often in the winter, which is about a 7 hour drive, which we usually take several breaks along the way. The first one is in a city called Mojave. There's a McDonald's there which we like to stop at. They've got a really huge parking lot, really clean bathrooms. So oftentimes, while the ladies are in the restroom, I'll slip quietly into line and buy some food to eat. A large Diet Coke, a 6-piece chicken McNuggets, and an order of large French fries. That's just for me. Now, those of you who have ever ordered fast food, there's usually a question that the person working behind the counter asks you at the end of every order. What is that question? No, not do you want to supersize it. That's a good one. Will that be for here or to go? And since we want to hurry up and get to Mammoth, as fast as we can, we usually order the food to go. But could you imagine if one time I tried to order the food to go, the person behind the counter got so upset at me and said, "You can't order takeout. You can't just eat and run. You have to stay in Mojave for a few days, check into a hotel, visit all our tourist stops, help the local economy, and then you could be on your way." Well, that's not exactly what happened in Samaria. And to fully understand the complexity of the issue, you have to know a little bit of the history, the animosity between Jews and Samaritans, which is for another time. But suffice it to say, when the Samaritans found out that Jesus wasn't going to spend the night, they took away the welcome mat and told him to get back on the road. Don't even think about stopping. Just keep on walking. Find another McDonald's. So this is where James enters the picture. Verse 54. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" That's how the passage read. And in most Bibles, you might notice there's a footnote there at the bottom that says earlier manuscripts include a reference to Elijah, which then renders the whole verse this way: "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them, even as Elijah did?" James and John, they were referring to an Old Testament passage tucked away in 2 Kings chapter 1, when the prophet Elijah actually struck down 100 Samaritan soldiers with fire coming down from heaven in that very same town. Now, most scholars agree that James and John didn't actually have that ability to call down fire from heaven. They said it as an expression which captured their emotions and their sentiment towards Jesus because they were so upset at the way Jesus was being treated. And so they wanted to roll up their sleeves and take matters into their own hands. "Jesus, you want us to take care of this? We can call down an airstrike from heaven. Just give us the coordinates." Verse 55. But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Again, in the footnotes, earlier manuscripts read, "But Jesus rebuked them, and he said to them, 'You do not know what kind of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them.' And so they went to another village." James, along with his brother John, were given nicknames following this story. The two of them were called the Sons of Thunder, Boanerges. Jesus gave them this nickname, which was very appropriate because they were thunderous. They want to shake things up. They wanted you shaking in your boots, which is the reason why they were called Sons of Thunder. What a great nickname. In John MacArthur's book entitled 12 Ordinary Men, he says, if there is a word, a key word that applies to the life of James, that word is passion. James lived with the kind of passion, a kind of intensity and fervor. He wasn't like Andrew, who may have been a little bit more soft-spoken. James let you know how he felt. James let you know what was on his mind. James was the kind of person who wore his heart on his sleeve, as they say, and you wanted a friend like James because he always had your back. If someone slighted you, James wouldn't let it go. If someone called you Pastor Porky, James would want to talk to you after the service outside. James lived with passion. He was devoted to Christ. He was full of zeal. He followed Christ enthusiastically. There was nothing lukewarm about James. So the takeaway for this week and the example from James is this: live passionately for the Lord, not half-heartedly. In our call to worship this morning, which was from the Shema, we are called to love the Lord with all of our hearts, all of our souls, all of our strength. Love the Lord the way Jesus loved the Lord the way James did, with energy, with passion, with enthusiasm. The word enthusiasm, by the way, it comes from two Greek words, en, theos. En meaning in, theos meaning God. So the full word enthusiasm means into the Lord, full of God. That's the way James lived his life. He was full of passion for the Lord. The second passage we looked at, Acts chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3, tells the story of how James died. James was put to death by Herod. This was Herod Agrippa, not Herod Antipas, who was the one who killed John the Baptist. And outside of Judas, the one who betrayed Jesus and took his own life, James is the only disciple in the Bible whose death is mentioned. But secondary sources say that after the resurrection, James took the gospel all the way to Spain, and when he returned, that's when he was captured by Herod and put to death by the sword. So, in Spain, guess who their patron saint is? Saint James. Also in Spain, there is a cathedral where supposedly St. James's remains are buried. And if you've ever been to Spain, there's something called the Camino de Santiago. Some of you are already nodding, which when translated, get this, means the way of St. James. It's a network of 9 roads that all lead to the cathedral. I think this picture shows it better. David, it's a picture. Kind of a blow-up of Spain and Portugal. But there's a series of roads, and they all lead to this one cathedral, and all of those paths are called the Camino de Santiago. There's also many stories about St. James and how his remains made it back to Spain, and along the coastline where the cathedral sits, they are known for their scallop industry. In fact, there are legends that when the boat that carried his body was shipwrecked off the coast of northern Spain, there's a story that miraculously James's body washed up on shore, completely intact, covered in scallop shells. So, all along the Camino de Santiago, they mark the trails with scallop shells, like in this picture. And to this day, the scallop shell is the symbol of the disciple James. That's why on the cover of the bulletin, if you were wondering, it's not a picture of our church, but it's a picture of a scallop shell, which is the symbol of St. James. As you go into this week and remember the story of James, go and rekindle your passion for God. Go and find your thunder. Rediscover the things that gets you excited for the Lord. Get back in touch with the things that gets your heart spiritually pumping. And as you go out into the world and serve others in Christ's name, serve the Lord with passion. And all God's people said,